Hi, everybody. We're here with Josh Pollock, who is basically kind of emerging as the voice of the WordPress REST API, certainly on the side of how to use it and how to program with it. Josh, how's it going?
Good. How are you guys?
Good. Yeah, good to talk to you. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about just how you got really interested and involved in the REST API itself. What's the sort of history there?
I went to WordCamp Milwaukee in 2014, and I met Rachel and Ryan, who are the co-lead developers of the project, and they were talking about this cool new REST API thing. And so was Mason, the lead developer of the WordPress, was there at the time too. He was talking about how this was going to change. It was very random for me. Like that was the first time I ever got accepted to speak at a WordCamp, so I went. I went at a guy, right? Pretty much clear across the country from Florida. And I went to their talk where they outlined like, this is what it does. This is what we're thinking. It was like, wow, this is really cool. And what's neat about WordPress is that we use it as the safe space to learn new things, right?
Yeah,
like I got into
that's
WordPress
very
when I
true.
knew like HTML, none of this like CSS fanciness or like HTML5, but like I knew like what a B tag was and a P tag and like, you know, how to add
Yeah,
that sort of stuff. But
I keep
WordPress
meaning to
is,
learn CSS, but
my
yeah.
goal is never to write another line of CSS ever again. It's literally like, if I have the kind of business success where I could be like, oh, somebody else will always be there for CSS, then that's a measure of success for me.
That's
Um,
great.
and that makes me the kind of perfect person for REST APIs because it's like, how do we build something that's just how do we deal with just abstract data, right? So a lot of people want to know like, what is a REST API? And it's this very machine, designed to be read by machines, a representation of data, a way of querying for data that opens up all the things that WordPress can already do. Show some posts, edit some posts, show some users, change who the author is, these sorts of things. New ways of dealing with that data in your own data and your plugins, your themes. And so for me, that's what's really exciting about it, is that it's a very modern way of working with this tool that we always had.
Yeah. So to maybe put you on the spot a bit, like maybe you could imagine a WordPress project that you could do, but you should be doing with the REST API. Or even if you have like some examples of some amazing stuff that's being done using the REST API, just to sort of like get people's minds working about like, where is this the right tool for the job?
So there's a lot of things that I see people using it with, and a lot of things that I use it with. It's a tool. It's not like, oh, this has REST API. People care for the most part, but developers care. One of the reasons why Twitter became so big is because they had this really easy to use REST API that allowed people to build clients. And they took a lot of pushback when they reduced the functionality that was available to outside developers. Because that was all these cool little apps built on top of Twitter is one of the reasons why Twitter became so ubiquitous. So the things there's a couple categories of things that are cool that get done with REST API. One is WordPress's content management system for something you wouldn't think of as being a website. So example of that, a Chicago Field Museum has these embedded touchscreens that have more information about the exhibit you're looking at. And who knows what that's written in, right? It's an embedded piece of hardware, but the backend is all managed in a local WordPress site. So the content creators are going into WordPress and editing that content in the images and these sorts of things, and then that's being consumed over the REST API into some sort of other system. So that's one sort of category. Another category would be, and this is the category that these next two are the ones that are sort of really interesting to me, is first would be people who are doing hybrid website web apps, but it's all in WordPress. So traditionally, you have a lot of these big brands that have these big sites and they put like their blog in WordPress and the rest is in something else. This would allow it to, you have where it's a traditional WordPress site, but then when you go to one URL, all of a sudden, that's a single page web app. So your blog, your about page is a traditional WordPress site, but then you have the single page web app that kind of spins up. and using Angular, React, or something like that. And then people take that further, which is cool, and put that into like a mobile app where they can develop something using WordPress as the data store, something like Angular, React as their front end, and then use something like PhoneGap to wrap that up into a mobile app they can then ship. So,
can I ask you a pretty general question about that?
Mhm.
The way my mind works is that WordPress might not be the best data store for most things because it's very oriented around posts just based on its sort of history.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering just how you think about that. Like if I did want to build like a single page web app that shows all the uninsured people in, New Hampshire or something like that, it feels like WordPress as a data store is a pretty questionable choice for that. What do you think about that?
So, I mean, this is one of those things where WordPress has a lot of great tooling for that sort of thing, right? Because if you were asking me to spec, I'd say, well, there's probably some third-party API that I can get that data from. And one of the things that's cool about WordPress is it has this really cool HTTP API for going out and querying other APIs, right? Mm-hmm. So let's hope that your state provides that information and I can get that from there. It has a caching layer for that. But yeah, I would probably move that into custom tables, and all these discussions get back to why WordPress. Mm-hmm. They really do. And in a lot of conversation, a lot of internal things I'm working on, the answer is no, right? Like Laravel's better for certain things. Mm-hmm. And it depends on what your end audience is. One of the cool things about WordPress is that there's so much WordPress in terms of pieces of the puzzle that are pre-built for you. Mm-hmm. In terms of people who you can call on to work with on your project, in terms of resources of people, and learning resources, educational resources, these sorts of things are just so ubiquitous and out there. Mm-hmm. And I know for me as a developer who's sort of self-taught or community taught, I like to say, because it's more accurate, it's a lot easier for me. Like I always talk about the fact that the first time I tried to learn Angular, I was also learning how Firebase worked. Mm. Right? I tried to build this app in Firebase with Angular, and I'd never done either before. And it was a disaster that never functioned at all, right? Like, we never got past loaded in like JavaScript error. That was where I got frustrated. Like, I never got past that. But because I'm familiar with WordPress, my second experience with Angular was building, and this actually gets into that third category of things I was going to suggest, which is making plugin and theme interfaces better with mm-hmm. REST API, which is where I'm a plugin developer, so I do this all the time. But my first experience doing that was with our A/B testing plugin Ingot, where we had this really crappy, very traditional WordPress admin, where mm-hmm. you were constantly reloading pages and going back and forth in the first version I built. Mm-hmm. So we rewrote it as this little mini Angular app, single-page web app sitting in a WordPress admin page. And I had to learn Angular, but I wasn't learning WordPress. I wasn't learning WordPress REST API, all these things. So all I had to do was learn Angular. And it's very similar to how I've learned everything else, where I'm just like, okay, WordPress works. I know everything else. Here's this new thing. And that's a huge benefit to us in the community of we know the rest of this stuff, right? I wasn't figuring out how to make a WordPress site, how to store custom table data in WordPress, right? These were things I already knew. How to wrap a REST API around custom table storage, right? That stuff wasn't new to me. What was new was using Angular. It was one new thing. And that's, a lot of times when we have frustrations learning, it's because we're trying to learn 3 new things at once.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, I just wrote, I'm like very beginner/intermediate in React. Mm-hmm. And I just wrote a thing about how I was able to ignore most of the stuff you need to know as an actual developer who uses React and just like focus on learning how to build a React app, because I worked in a WordPress environment and I basically just like wrote the data right into a JavaScript file and stuff. And so I definitely understand that learning one thing at a time is, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've been having trouble learning a lot of these new JavaScript frameworks that are written in the new JavaScript or TypeScript. And I had this light go off and went, that's because you don't understand ES6 and TypeScript, Josh. Mm-hmm. It's like you're trying to learn Angular 2 and TypeScript at the same time. Back up and learn TypeScript.
Yeah.
and then come back to Angular 2, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so this third category you talked about, I know I kind of like completely sidetracked you out of your very clean and very elegant sort of three-part thing about the REST API. Third part is just better interfaces for WordPress plugins and things that sit in the WordPress admin. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and also in the front end. It's an opportunity to start to get rid of those distinctions, in a sense, right? So in the workshop that we're doing, I show how to build a front-end editor for WordPress content. And the thing that I point out is that the amount of server-side PHP code involved is like 4 lines, and it's just a load JavaScript, right? WP increase script, WP localize script, right? That's it. But what that doesn't skip on the server side is data sanitization, data validation, and authorization, right? Can this user actually create that post, edit that post? And that's all done in WordPress. So previously, I would have had to build all of that custom. And so not only is that time and maintenance, and my system's different than how you would have built it and how you would have built it, right? Fred would build it one way, David would build it another way, I'd build it another way. And hopefully none of the 3 of us would screw up just being one person. Whereas having it in this plugin that apparently now is up to 90 contributors, and that hopefully will be in core, which has hundreds of people looking at it, we're not, the more that we can take away from our own responsibility for doing like content editing, right? Secure and authorized, the merrier. So being able to create a custom post editor, for front-end submissions that you can also drop into the back end, that kind of stuff, without worrying about anything on the server side is a big deal. It's just install the REST API and then write some JavaScript is very different than the traditional way that we would have looked at this. But also, for me, I'm a plugin developer. So Caldera Forms, we're just starting to use more REST API stuff and looking at how do we rebuild our entry viewer in a way that it can do double purpose as a front. Right now it's an admin thing, like maybe look at my entries. How can we rebuild that in a way that's not just functions better, but starts to have search built in, starts to be something that you would want to put on the front end of your website? It can be very modular, could potentially not exist on your website, exist somewhere else.
Cool. So I think one of the things we wanted to touch on was the process of, and you just mentioned it, about when and how the REST API is finally going to be in core and how long it's been. I mean, you mentioned you learned about it in 2014 and it's almost the end of 2016. What are your thoughts and vision about when and how this all has happened and will happen?
Yeah, so minor history lesson to make sure everybody's on the same page. This is something that Ryan McHugh was kicking around for a while. Remember that Ryan McHugh is really young. Like he's like 22 or something. And he's been contributing to WordPress forever. Like the whole term splitting thing has its origin in a ticket he opened when he was 14, pointing out a serious flaw in the way that WordPress stores terms. It took years to fix. But the version 1 of the REST API got to basically complete and then said, like, okay, here's what we've learned and why this is kind of silly. Right, let's do this better. Let's start over with the version 2. And that was finished enough with this plan last year in 4.4 to put in the infrastructure for making REST APIs. And that happened, right? So right now in core, there is this infrastructure for building REST APIs. So think of that much like we think of WP query or WP rewrites, in the sense of those are underlying tools that we can use to do custom queries, custom endpoints in the front end, but also they get used so that way your theme just magically knows it needs to show all posts in category Star Wars, right?
Sure.
But what we don't have is that second half of the thing, right? We don't have the automatic display of content like we have in themes. And that was supposed to be in 4.5. And there's been a real discussion of whether or not that makes sense in core. There are a few prickly parts that have all been sort of sorted out. And the 4.7 merge proposal says all of your objections were stored. If this is a thing we're going to want to do, it's done. And that also includes a proposal for an OAuth server as well. The WordPress REST API uses the same authentication as WordPress. A lot of confusion around this. And if you're doing it in a WordPress front end, you might as well just send the same cookie and authenticate the same way. But if you're using WordPress as a store for data that's connecting somewhere else, you need some other way of authenticating. And there are a lot of plugins that do this. And so the current question right now is, does WordPress core provide OAuth? Or do we say, hey, there's an OAuth plugin, there's an OAuth 1, what it would provide. Because OAuth 2 requires HTTPS and WordPress does not. Or do we say, hey, there's an official OAuth 1 server, but also there's an OAuth 2 plugin out there. There's a JWT token plugin out there. You can roll your own thing because not everybody needs this. That's sort of the sticky point right now. And then the question is, I've only heard one person say it, that if there is no authentication outside of the standard WordPress authentication, then forget it. It's not worthwhile. The problem is that guy's name is Matt. So that's a sticky part. As far as I've said, and maybe other people, or I've seen, as far as I've seen, he's the one who's saying like, well, if there's no authentication for the update stuff, right? Like you'd be able to read the same data that you can already read publicly, right? The REST API sort of reproduces the existing scheme. So it's like, well, if you're an admin, you can read everything and update everything. If you're an editor, you have less. If you're not logged in, well, you can read public stuff, but you can't read private stuff. You can't update anything. So that's sort of the sticky point, and I don't know. I'm an optimist. So I think it's going to work out because there are a lot of people who really want this and put a lot of time into it, and it's really nice stuff. And having it in core would mean that we could build new stuff with WordPress, assuming that everybody has it, right? Assuming a plugin is installed is sort of different than saying, if you're in WordPress 4.7 or later, we're good.
Yeah.
That's where we're at. And I'm an optimist. I think in December, the content stuff will be in WordPress when 4.7 comes out. These content endpoints. The infrastructure is still there. And for me as a plugin developer, that's beautiful because I spin up custom REST APIs on top of that all the time. But I think a lot of people who have looked at services they can offer for content editing, different types of display, they're not sure until they get that.
Related question. If you want to learn the REST API in the way that most people are going to use it, like let's say you're a plugin editor and you want to start being able to write admin, plugin admins that are single page JavaScript apps. Is the way the REST API works like done? Is what you learn now going to be what works in 5 years or 10 years? Or is that still sort of churning?
Well, so there's, as I said, there's two pieces to this. There's the infrastructure that went in 4.4. And so that's, one of the cool things about WordPress is the commitment to backwards compatibility. So, maybe it's going to change over 10 years, but for the most part, that's going to be there. And now that we're a few versions out, it's hard for an existing plugin to go, you must be on the latest WordPress. But now that we're approaching 4.7 and we're talking about stuff that's been there since 4.4, I'm comfortable saying, hey, this next version has a bunch of cool stuff, but you've got to be on 4.4 or later because that's like a year-old, friends. Get with the program. And most of the people who aren't going to don't update WordPress version for a year are the people who don't update plugins. So forever, who cares? There are a lot of people out there with sites that work and they're not touching anything. So who cares? They don't need new features. Their site works. And they're not maintaining it. So that stuff is what you really need for most plugin stuff. Most of the time you're adding your own endpoints. So I would recommend learning that stuff, how route declarations work, how the callbacks work, how the authentication should be done, how the sanitization validation. It's very neat stuff. Some of the better written stuff in WordPress. And from there, you're good. You're not relying on the plugin. That's very different from the kind of person who says, oh, I have this idea for a better way of managing posts. Well, now you're determined on the plugin. And the plugin, they've intentionally called a beta, you'll notice. It's at like beta 14 or beta 15 right now.
Yeah.
Because they're committed to getting it right, not to back, and they're now saying like, okay, this is very, very right. We would put this into WordPress core at 4.7 and then not have backwards compatibility changes. But, there have been breaking changes in the beta so far. And the cool thing about the way the REST API is built is the endpoints are at v2, right? WP JSON /WP/v2. So I would suspect in a few years, once these endpoints are merged, you might see a push to build a new plugin that does /v3 and does things a little bit better based on what we've learned or taking advantage of new advancements in core. And this is an opportunity that we don't really have in other parts of core, right? You can't really do a WP query v2 that exists in parallel with WP query.
Yeah.
It has but in that scenario, you could have a period of time where you could have version 3 that sort of works and we're using it for some things and it comes along and at no point does that affect the performance of version 2. So it's Post got this new feature for version 3 that I need, but I'm not ready, but I'll keep using version 2 for users, or, okay, I'm not messing with that new stuff. I'm going to keep to the old stuff. I really like that for the future. And we use that when we use with third-party APIs. I was just looking, I just got an email from Dawala, which is a thing that money transfer service that we integrate with Caldera Forms, and they said, hey, we're no longer maintaining version 1, but it still works. But all the cool new stuff's going in version 2 on their API. Right? We can have those kind of things in WordPress, where we keep things stable, and as long as they're secure, we just let them be. But we're able to move forward. And that's kind of baked in. So that's why I feel good about it.
Well, I think one thing that I remember from our talking was we wanted to kind of, what do you think about how one should go about learning about the REST API right now? Like what resources and or what kind of things are hard or easy for an existing WordPress developer to wrap their head around, that sort of stuff?
Right. That's a good question.
Josh, because you're sort of the biggest and largest and best teacher of the REST API that exists in our universe, don't be shy about just, if you're the best at that, then just say your own stuff a bunch. I just want to make sure that you...
Oh, don't worry, I'm not. If people shouldn't be. Seriously. It's one of the fun things is I'll Google how to do X with WordPress and find an article I wrote that I forgot about and don't remember. And it's really nice that I did myself that solid and wrote it down. It's a fun thing when it happens. So I would say, in general, there are two types of learners. I mean, there are a lot of different types of learners out there. But there are people who really like to read. There are people who really like to watch videos. So I would frame it in both of those ways. And also, what are you trying to learn, right? Are you trying to learn what all the endpoints do in the core plugin? Are you trying to learn how to make your own REST API endpoints? And are you trying to learn how to use a JavaScript framework to build something cool with this stuff? And I want to point out that you don't have to use a JavaScript framework to use this stuff. You can consume it in PHP. You can consume it in some other language. That said, React, Angular, these sort of things, they're cool. And you can make really cool stuff. So it's a sensible thing to be looking at. So to answer it, I've written a ton for Torque, mainly. Some stuff at joshpress.net, mainly at torquemag.io about the REST API. There's also really good docs at v2.wp-api.org that cover the basics. And I've written a ebook for Torque that's free to download that covers hey, these are what the endpoints do, and here's some cool stuff you could build with them. So that's really good type of introductory stuff. I would definitely look also in video world at, we have a course at learn.joshpress.net on the REST API that goes through, this is what it is, this is how to add custom routes, this is how authentication goes. And here's the basics of using Angular to build a little app like this. Gives you a little bit of everything. We're gonna have another course coming out soon. We've recorded it, but it's not been edited. Which you can pre-order. On looking at being a better PHP developer in the world of the REST API, in terms of how do I design plugins and sites, my PHP code, so it's good, solid, object-oriented code that can be consumed the old-fashioned way, you know, in a theme, in a short code, in a PHP function, and in a REST API, right? Become a better PHP developer so you could do these kind of jobs. Also, Royce Vaughn has some really good courses on Lynda, on using the REST API to build Angular apps. Those I would recommend. So I really think, you know, go to our site, learn.joshpress.net, to get the first REST API course. If you're into videos that want to just have Josh explain all of this to you over 3.5 hours, it's a good overview. And then for something more practical and hands-on, once you have that basis, look at Roy's stuff on Lynda. Just search Royce Vaughn, Lynda, Angular, and he sort of gives you very practical, let's build a web app with this stuff. And if you're into reading, yeah, I mean, the stuff I've done on Torque, Tuts Plus has a bunch of cool series by a few different people on getting started with the REST API and building specific stuff with it. Most people are, especially in the WordPress world, are give me something tangible. So I would going back to what we were talking about before, find a project that uses the REST API, but it's just one new thing, right? People get overwhelmed trying to learn 17 new things at once or 3 new things at once. So find a project that uses the REST API with something you're comfortable with. Get you comfortable with the REST API. You know, have these materials on hand to help you, and then take it a step further. You know, add in Angular, add in React, whichever one you're into.
That's really good advice. To pick up a question David sort of asked, what is the hardest single piece of learning the REST API? And is it in fact authentication, which is sort of the part that I seem to get. Like, it wasn't so much that authentication was hard, it's that as I started to look into it, I saw like this debate going on like forums and stuff, and it had this quality of like sort of a tortured group scream. And so it made me think that this is probably one of the more convoluted pieces of the REST API. So is that in fact the hardest part, or what is, if you really want to learn this stuff?
I'm not sure what the answer to the hardest part is, because that's a difficult thing to answer. But let's talk about authentication, because that could be one of the hardest to understand, because it's been one of the poorest explained. Is that if you look in the code for the content API, all of the permissions checks are current user can and then a permission, right? And that's like anywhere else in WordPress, right? You say current user can manage options before you let them update the options from your plugin screen, right? Say can current user edit posts before you let them edit posts, right? So that's nothing new. If you've done WordPress development before, then you know that. Where it gets tricky is, how do you set current user, right? If everything is about current user can, then the question is, how did you set the current user? And if you're using the REST API inside of a WordPress site, all you need to do is send with your request a nonce on the action WP_REST. And everything's handled for you. Go to the docs, read the authentication page. It's very clearly spelled out how to do it in jQuery and in other similar formats. Now, here's the next step is, what if you're not inside of WordPress, right? Now you have a lot of options. And the thing is, there's no one size fits all. Because there's OAuth 1, there is OAuth 2. These are different but related protocols, both of which are a pain in the ass and solve very different problems than most of us have. There is JWT token authentication, which is much simpler. That's what I use, by the way. If you're sensing a bias there, you are correct. There's a plugin on .org for JWT authentication via the REST API. It's very simple to use. It's very secure. It's fairly secure if you're over HTTPS. I mean, the thing is, people get hung up on like man-in-the-middle attacks over HTTP. It's like, yeah, if you're serving your site over HTTP, you have that problem on WP login. Get over it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Don't come at me with security concerns that you're too cheap to run on HTTPS, right? Like, but you can do things. You can run your own, right? There's a filter that you could use to set WP to set the current user. So I've done projects where it's like, if we're on this specific request, allow, check for these two get variables, and then, check them against, do a public key, secret key. That's a little bit weaker, but as long as it's not over HTTP, there's no man-in-the-middle concerns, right? So there's a lot there, and it gets very convoluted. But remember, it's all about how do we set current user, right? And from there, it's all just normal WordPress. And that all comes down to the context. And I think we get caught up in there's so many options. But the thing is, so many options is good because none of them are the right answer 100% of the time. Mm-hmm. Just don't get into this whole I have to use OAuth because, I don't know, OAuth's annoying. And it's not, there's no categorical reason why it has to be used. When somebody says like, oh, I have to use OAuth, say why? What advantage does that have over using WordPress standard cookies, over JWT, over using some sort of public secret key system? Why is authentication needed at all, right? If it's just read, who cares?
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think the point about piggybacking on WordPress's default implementation of auth for an admin screen, like that's a great place to start because then you don't even need to worry about auth, which is, reasonably, as you went into great detail on, there are a lot of options and they aren't all clear to you. And especially if you've never done any of them before, I think it can be really overwhelming to encounter the 6 things that we kind of talked about. But if you're just making an admin screen, you can just take advantage of the fact that it's basically baked in.
Oh yeah, that's totally simple. And there's an entire section of the course that's out there right now on my site. You can get it all as one, or you can get it in 4 different pieces. And one of them is authentication basics. And it covers cookies, it covers roll your own, and so that way you understand the theory. I kind of don't encourage roll your own, but I think it's good for understanding the theory. And I cover JWT because it's the simplest way to do it securely outside of WordPress. Like request a header, request a token and then send that token back with all your further requests.
Cool. Josh, thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to say about the REST API in general? Just anything that, you'd like to put out there?
I would put out there, use it. Remember that like you don't always have to use it. Right? Like it's not the answer to everything. What were we talking about doing the other day? And Roy and I were talking about doing something in a chat that and Ryan McHugh said, it doesn't have to be REST API everything. Like it sounds like you're trying to work around a problem that maybe shouldn't have been there, right? It's not a magic bullet. End users want something cool, right? And I always encourage people to look at it that way. Like, how can I show my client something cooler, my user something cooler that they wouldn't expect from WordPress? Because, your end users of your website don't go, oh man, that's some JSON stuff right there, right? Like look at your phone and tell me how many of those apps are using a JSON REST API, how many are using SOAP, how many are using XML, how many are using like GraphQL. You don't care. You care if the app sucks or not. Is it a pain to use? Is it performant? And so I would think about it in those terms of like, how can I use this tool to make my end user happier? And hopefully your client happier, right? It's great when those two things align, right? If you're doing development work, it's like, can I make my client's users happier and impress my client? And when those two things come in line, it's awesome. And how can you do things that you wouldn't have done? How can you say, hey, for X, we can make you a website, and for 150% of that, I can make you a website and a mobile app, right? Or I could do something very old school, or I can do something that you wouldn't have expected with a single page web application without, reducing page loads with infinite scrolls type stuff, that sort of thing. How can you say to your client, hey, you would normally come to me for a blog and somebody else for the app side. Here's how we could do both in one. It would be easier to manage. I would charge you more than I would normally charge, but less than you'd pay 2 developers. Right? So just think about how you can do things better. Because that's the point of fun new technology, is that we can do better. And the other thing, I think it's a project we can learn, because this has been a bumpy road, right? I hope that we'll be able to learn from this, because, right, like WordPress is going to need to support like virtual reality in a year or two. It's going to need to support like direct brain hallucination interface, whatever that is, in a few more years.
I keep waiting for that. DBH. I'm like, why isn't this in DBH? That's just me. Truly.
But like Firefox now has an experimental API for websites to serve VR versions. Like, how do we continue to stay WordPress to be the thing that just kind of works and does it for everybody, so that way there keeps being so much more WordPress? So we have people to sell clients to, or to sell form plugins to, or to have read WPShout to. So I hope that we as a community can learn from this experience, and the next cool thing is easier to build into WordPress. And for individuals, I say just think about ways to think about ways to just do things better and cooler. It's more fun that way. Like, that's why we're doing this, right? It's just to have fun. So have more fun.
That's good advice. Let's close with just, where can people find you? What do you want to shout out? Just that you do in general.
Yeah. So my company is Caldera Labs. We make WordPress plugins. We do Caldera Forms. It's a drag and drop form builder at calderawp.com. And you can also find me on Twitter at Josh412. So take over Josh412, and I'll run my mouth off about the Caldera Forms there for you.
Gotcha. Josh, it's so good to talk to you. This is
good to talk to you guys too.
Fascinating stuff, and it's really here. It's really cool to just like, I'm rambling, but basically that was very lucid and very cool, and I learned a lot, and I'm very glad that this is how I spent my 45 minutes.
Well, thanks for having me on.